Greetings. I'm back and talking a little bit about the Gospels and especially their contribution to our understanding of the use of the Old Testament in the New Testament. In this segment, I want to talk about this topic, New Testament use of the Old Testament, and especially insights from Hayes and some questions that might arise as well. So again, we'll be reading Richard Hayes' book on this topic this week, or at least one of his books on this topic, to help jumpstart our thinking. Let me say before I get specific that Hayes is one of the contemporary giants in New Testament research, at least from the conservative side of things. He would be broadly evangelical, but I don't think he's an inerrantist, and is more open to some critical conclusions, say, than the average ETS member. Some of his influences, excuse me, include Hans Frey and the Yale School, this literary analysis approach focusing on the text rather than the history behind the text. So he's definitely not focusing on historical, critical, or social science approaches, for example. But I've always found his writing stimulating and challenging. His groundbreaking work on Paul's hermeneutics was Echoes of Scripture in the Letters of Paul. He pointed out that there to the Old Testament allusions and images, as well as quotations, that shaped Paul's theological vision. It's still worth a read. It's a classic. Part of the theme is this use of intertextuality. It's a big buzzword. The kind of connections that go beyond straight citation, borrowing a word or a phrase that connects two passages without extensive argument. He also argues that Paul read the Old Testament Christologically, that is in light of Christ, see Luke 24, and ecclesiologically, in light of the mission of the church rather than of Israel, both of which insights I think are useful and helpful. And perhaps we can talk more about that later. He's written prolifically on New Testament issues. The other specific work I want to mention is his discussion of New Testament ethics, the moral vision of the New Testament. I can almost guarantee you won't agree with something there, but as one of the major works on this issue, well worth reading. He argues for pacifism, for a traditional view on homosexuality, and a host of other issues. But very thoughtful and focused reading of the New Testament for ethical reflection. Although I'm sure there are other books on the use of the Old Testament and the New Testament we could read, the book we're reading is one of Hayes' recent books and connects to the Gospels, so it just seemed like it was a decent fit here. He has a larger version that's come out, which is much longer and a bit too much to handle in this course, I'm afraid. But I hope this will at least get you on the right track and help you think about some of the themes there. Perhaps in the residency, I'll talk a little bit more about the larger work. This book does have the advantage of being relatively short and hence manageable with everything else we're trying to get through. But let's be clear what it is not. It's not a complete theory of how the Old Testament is used by the New Testament. You can get that 4 views on the Old Testament, New Testament use of the Old Testament, something like that. It's focused only on the Gospels, and especially on what he calls figural readings, hence the reading backwards title. So it's a very specific take on a very specific kind of use, but one that I think is generative of a lot of interesting thoughts and discussions. So I think it's helpful, and I hope you'll find it useful. His discussion does highlight, at least briefly, a number of interesting issues. One, for him, he argues the source for the Old Testament, the source text for the Old Testament used by the gospel writers, and he made a similar argument with Paul, that the Septuagint is the dominant influence. And I think that is increasingly the consensus. And that is even more plausible by recent studies that argue that the Septuagint text excuse me, was fairly fluid. So even some texts that seem to point to the Masoretic text may reflect a variant Septuagint text that we don't have access to. And he follows through with specific examples. So brush up on your Septuagint if you want to understand the New Testament. And that's an interesting suggestion, isn't it? He also talks about the role of synoptic problem in interpretation. And again, he doesn't spend a lot of time on this. Again, remember, his approach is primarily literary. So he's interested in the final form of the text, not in the history of the text behind the text. So I admit I kind of like his overall sensibilities. Regardless of your conclusions, 2 source, 4 source, 8 source, no source, hypothesis, whatever it is, I do think it's dangerous to make definitive statements, exegetical conclusions, based on your reconstruction of that history, which we can't know for sure. We can never do enough to have a real answer, and we can do enough, I think, interpretively without a final solution. Even though I think it's likely there's some sort of literary dependence. I think if you look closely at the text, it's hard to argue against that. As far as Q, well, I mostly ignore it, and I think you'd be wise to too, but that's a whole other debate. A third thing is there's this notion of figural interpretation as opposed to prediction. I think Hayes here, this is maybe my one quibble with Hayes, is fuzzier here than I would like. I don't have any problem with there being a number of direct Old Testament predictions fulfilled in the New Testament. And I suspect he might be fine with that too, although in a few places he makes me wonder just a bit. I'd love to ask him if I had him here in person. But the focus of his discussion is not on those kinds of things anyway. It's on other types of reading, these figural readings, these allusions, these echoes. In these cases, the original human author and audience in the Old Testament text might not see the significance, but the New Testament can, and so can we. It's sort of similar to typology in a way, in that it could be explained in terms of defined intentionality, but not human. Excuse me. But the precise boundaries are fuzzy, though it seems to me Hayes is right, or at least might be, but at least a good number of New Testament texts. So let's be honest. Many of us would, as Hayes suggests, harshly grade an Old Testament exegetical paper that said some of those Old Testament texts, the Passover, are really about Jesus, at least in the Old Testament context. The demand that we read the New Testament with a much richer Old Testament understanding is also an important emphasis of Hayes. He wants to avoid a Marcionite type of approach. The example he provides beginning on page 9 of Thomas's approach to the parable of the wicked tenants is a helpful example. It provides a powerful example of how Thomas is far from the Old Testament and the authentic New Testament perspective. The main substance of Hayes' work is a careful reading of each of the 4 Gospels on their own terms. So again, no homogenization, no harmonization. Instead, what does Matthew say? What does Mark say? What does Luke say? What does John say? How each uses the Old Testament, what that usage says about Jesus especially. There are lots of things I could say here, but I will simply note for time's sake. There's no harmonizing of the Gospels, as I've already mentioned. Second, his conclusions on the teaching of the Gospels regarding Jesus are uniformly orthodox and quite conservative. He argues each of the Gospels is a high Christology, as his insistence that the Gospel writers don't create things. This is not fantasy stuff. Nevertheless, at times his critical stance, the way he dates certain Gospels, or even a discussion of the reshaping of traditions, might make some of us just a bit uncomfortable. If you squirm in your seat, that's okay. Don't let that distract you from his helpful observations. His concluding chapter summarizes and makes some suggestions. Some you'll probably like, perhaps a few you'll hate, but he will definitely force you to wrestle with important issues. Welcome to PhD world, right? If I can step away from Hayes for just a second, I'd like to dip back into the book by Stuart Parsons that I mentioned last week. One feature of his study of Theophilus is relevant here. Theophilus' use of Scripture. Though not a New Testament book, it does suggest something about how early Christians thought Scripture should be interpreted. So I just want to highlight them for you, and you can find them useful or not. Here's what I found. First, again, the use of the Septuagint is prominent. So again, just as Hayes argues for the Gospels, the early church used the Septuagint far more than the Hebrew text. Second, an interesting one is there's an increasing consensus that much biblical citation in the apostolic era, post-apostolic era, was from memory rather than textual sources. From various studies on orality and oral cultures, scholars increasingly suggest shorter quotations and allusions, and even echoes, come more from the memory rather than from reading a text. Parsons uses, just to help you understand where this is at, Parsons uses a cutoff of 16 words. If it's less than 16 words, it's probably from memory. If it's more than 16, it's likely textual. Again, that's a little arbitrary, but there are reasons to think somewhere in that vicinity or that neighborhood there's that kind of break. This kind of approach provides at least a general way to think about this aspect of quotation. And we can ask, does a similar pattern apply to the New Testament use of the Old Testament? Shorter quotes, are those from memory? Longer from texts? Is there something like that going on? Interesting. A third thing that I found fascinating about Parsons' study is there's an increasingly empirical or computer-driven way to do this analysis. I'm not sure that we need to do this for the New Testament text because there's been so much attention historically on this. And so I think a lot of that work has been done by grunt work, if you will, over time. And so I'm not sure we're going to find as much new material there. But for many of the church fathers, there are now rigorous computational models that help us sort out what is actually happening with these texts, how they actually use it, where they draw from, what kind of uses they use, and things like that. And Parsons actually covers much of this for Theophilus. If you're interested, the appendixes in Parsons provide some of the data and give you an idea of what might be possible. If you're interested in seeing it and you don't have it, I have it, or you can get it fairly cheap, at least it was at one point, on the Kindle. So take a look at this, see what you think. Some of you might be interested in this kind of research somewhere along the way. In any event, that's just a barely touch upon some of the issues related to Old Testament being used by the New Testament, focused primarily in the Gospels, focused particularly on a particular kind of use, but one that I think will be generative of other thoughts. Have a great week, and I will try to get over this cough. Bye-bye for now.